Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, where we discuss everything in the world of fantasy football. As always, I'm your host, Jeremiah, and man, oh man, what a day so far. We had the breaking news that literally just took over the NFL world by storm in the past half hour, and that is the Minnesota Vikings will not pick up their option on Adrian Peterson's contract for the 2017 season, which means Adrian Peterson will become an unrestricted free agent on March 9th. And I'm telling you right now, he becomes the top free agent on the market. He will get interest on a variety of teams. And it's going to be who is the highest bidder on AP. And don't get me wrong, he's 32 years old. I'm not shocked that the Vikings did not pick up their option. He's 32 years old. I don't think he's going to be that MVP caliber player. I don't think he's going to be that type of guy again. I think that guy is pretty much long gone. But AP can be a valuable player on the team. So this is the fantasy show. And I wanted to talk about this from a fantasy perspective because, you know, this is what I do on this particular podcast. The teams that AP said he wanted to play for were the New York Giants, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and the Houston Texans. So those three teams are they're on the wish list on Adrian Peterson. Me, personally, I think he's going to sign with the New York Giants. I do think he will get really good fantasy value on that team. And I think, you know, the Oakland Raiders should get interested in AP with Latavius Murray not coming back and signing elsewhere. I think the Raiders should take a look at Adrian Peterson. But from a realistic standpoint, I do think that the fantasy value of Adrian Peterson, I don't think it's as high as it. I don't think it's high anymore. He's not going to be a first rounder. You're not going to get him in the second round. I don't think he could be a RB1 for your fantasy team anymore. I think those days are long gone. But I do think he has a chance to be productive. I think if he goes to the Giants, I do think he has a chance to have a really good productive season. I think he can have a really, really better season than he had last year. Last year, he was just awful. In the games that he played, which was 3, he only averaged 1.9. 1.9 yards a carry. And, you know, the Giants, they do got Paul Perkins there. They released Rashad Jennings. And Paul Perkins is probably slated to be the starter of the team. He's a guy that I really like. But I do think if AP does sign, Paul Perkins is not going to draw a lot of fantasy interest unless as a handcuff to Adrian Peterson, which could happen. But I do think if Adrian Peterson does sign with the New York Giants, I think he has a really good shot being a RB2 because I do think the Giants are going to mix in Paul Perkins there. He has a chance to be RB2. I do think with the Giants being a passing first team, I do think that can actually help Adrian Peterson to take the pressure off Eli Manning. And, Eli Manning, he's at the back end of his career. I do think he still has a couple of good years left in him. He's got Odell Beckham Jr. So you got a solid core of offensive players. This is a team that made the playoffs. Adrian Peterson wants to play for a contender, so I do think this makes sense. And I don't know if he can be a good fit for Tampa Bay, because I know Doug Martin is suspended. And I just don't think Adrian Peterson wants to take a back seat to anybody. And because, if Doug Martin, when he does come back after those 4 games, and if Adrian Peterson is on the Buccaneers roster, how are they going to play both of these guys? Because AP is not going to want to take a back seat. He wants to be the guy. And, Doug Martin, I think he still has a lot left in the tank, a lot more than Adrian Peterson, and he's younger. So for me, I don't think that makes sense for Adrian Peterson. I don't think it makes sense for a fantasy standpoint. I do think if AP does go to the Bucs, I think maybe he can be a low-end RB2. I just don't think he's someone that can really help your team out. I just think he's there to be on the bench. And the other team on Adrian Peterson's wish list is the Houston Texans. And if he goes there, he has to share carries with Lamar Miller as well. And remember, the Texans are a team that could potentially get Tony Romo. So from a contender, from a winning standpoint, it makes sense for Adrian Peterson, because if Tony Romo goes to the Texans, I do think they become a Super Bowl contender. AP, that's the one thing he hasn't played. That's the one thing he doesn't have on his resume is a Super Bowl. And I do think that's something that he really, truly wants. So if Adrian Peterson does go to the Houston Texans with Lamar Miller already there, I don't think it's going to work out. I do think Adrian Peterson's not going to want to take a back seat. I do think that Lamar Miller thinks he's a guy. He went to Houston to be the guy anyway, so I don't think it would work out well. So that's why I think the New York Giants is the perfect team for him to go to. He's going to have a chance to get a lot of carries. He's going to have a chance to show people what he's got left. I do think he will. I do think he can potentially score touchdowns. I don't think he can get I don't think he can have those games where he gets 150, 125 yards. I think he's one of the type of guys that can get touchdowns. I don't think he's going to have a 100-yard game every day, every Sunday, but he's someone that's going to be really productive in the New York Giants offense if he signs there. I talked about this on the football show on Monday, and I do think that with Latavius Murray signing elsewhere other than the Oakland Raiders, I think they should look into, at least get interested in signing Adrian Peterson, or at least getting the meeting with him. With the young core of the Oakland Raiders offense, you had Derek Carr, Michael Crabtree, Amari Cooper. Latavius Murray, he did have 12 touchdowns. But he kind of took a backseat with Jalen Richard and DeAndre Washington there. So the reason why I said AP will make sense in Oakland is because, 1, they're a contender. 2, they have a really good offense. And then 3, they have really good depth at running back. And I do think that would make sense for Adrian Peterson. But if he wants to go to a Super Bowl, I do think the Giants do make kind of sense. I do think that gives them a legitimate shot of a Super Bowl. If Tony Romo goes to the Texans and AP goes to the Texans, then I do think AP has a shot of going to the Super Bowl. But as for the Vikings, I do think that they're going to address the running back position in the draft. I do think they're not going to get Leonard Fournette. He's going to go in the top 5, top 10. They're not going to get Dalvin Cook. I do think that, Dante Foreman, Christian McCaffrey, I do think those are guys that they can perhaps target. If they can trade up to get Dalvin Cook, maybe Leonard Fournette, then that would be great. But as of now, I do think that the Vikings really want a running back, a young running back to start over. So, if AP goes to the Giants, I say he's on RB2. I do think that the Raiders should get interested in him because they got a great O-line. And I do think that's the reason why he did struggle with the Vikings was because of the offensive line. But it looks like that the Giants could be the team that makes the most sense. And if he does indeed sign there next week or agrees to sign there, I do think he can be a RB2 because of the talent around him. Well, enough about Adrian Peterson. I'm going to take my first break. I'm actually going to talk about Kirk Cousins. Yes, there was some news this morning on Kirk Cousins on a particular team that he wants to play for. And I'll let you know what that team is when I get back to the Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And there looks to be one team in particular that Kirk Cousins wants to play for, and it is not the Washington Redskins. According to ESPN, it looks like that Kirk Cousins' preferred destination is with the San Francisco 49ers. And, I think from a fantasy perspective, I do think it will hinder Kirk Cousins' value a little bit. There's just simply no talent there. I do think that the fact of the matter is that he did play for Kyle Shanahan in Washington when he first got drafted there. I do think that it could be a really good marriage. And I do think that if Kirk Cousins does go to the 49ers, that offense is 5 times better than the way they played last year because they were awful. They were god-awful. Kidding me? And, Kirk Cousins, he is expected to be franchise tagged by the Redskins before the Wednesday deadline, and once Cousins signs the tag, he can no longer talk to other teams. Cousins could get traded still, though, if the Redskins decide to work out a trade. But if Washington does trade Kirk Cousins to any team other than the 49ers, he's not going to sign a long-term deal. So, from a fantasy perspective, it looks like the Redskins will not have as much talent as they had last season. Because remember, Jordan Reed is still signed to this team. Deshaun Jackson is a free agent. Pierre Garçon is a free agent. Matt Jones and the other running backs on that team, their fantasy value could hinder a little bit. I do think that, if Cousins does remain with the Washington Redskins, I do think Jordan Reed's impact will be in the top 5. But honestly, though, I think no matter who is the quarterback for Washington next year, I do think Jordan Reed will be a top tight end. But for the 49ers and a fantasy perspective of that team, I do think it's going to bode well huge for Vance McDonald. Remember, Vance McDonald is signed to a 5-year contract with the 49ers. He signed that extension last year. And, they got to bring guys at the receiver position. They got guys like Alshon Jeffrey on the market. That's going to be on the market. You got Deshaun Jackson that's going to be on the market as well. I do think that Deshaun Jackson is going to play in Philly, but I think that the Niners could generate some interest in Deshaun Jackson if they happen to land Kirk Cousins. I do think with the fact that Kirk Cousins and Deshaun Jackson played on the team already in Washington, that can bode well huge for the 49ers offense. And it looks like Carlos Hyde's fantasy value could increase as well if this were to happen. And remember, Carlos Hyde, he's been generated as a RB1, RB2. He's been on that borderline for the past 2 years now. It's just that he just cannot stay healthy. So maybe that's partly the reason because of the offensive line. Maybe that's partly of the reason of the quarterback position and the mediocre play at that position. But I do think that Cousins he will improve the team if he does sign with the 49ers. And I do think the fact that he's worked with Kyle Shanahan really could be a really good marriage, and it can be something that they can build on for maybe the next 10 years. So it looks like Cousins, it looks like he's not going to sign a long-term deal with Washington, and he looks like he just doesn't want to be there anymore. He just doesn't. So, Cousins' current stance could limit the market for Washington, and, if Cousins does not play for Washington Redskins next year, I still think Jordan Reed's fantasy value is still in the top 5. I still think that no matter who's a quarterback, he will be just fine because remember, he is the big play target on that team with Pierre Garçon and Deshaun Jackson testing the free agent market. They're not going to be back on that team. They're just not. And, that was a top 5 offense, but with Kirk Cousins and the possible destination that he can go to, I do think that, with Cousins going to San Francisco, that can possibly generate some interest from a couple of free agents. I think Alshon Jeffrey will be a really good receiver with Cousins. Deshaun Jackson could have some interest because remember he is from California. And I do think Vance McDonald's fantasy value could increase because of Kirk Cousins. And I think Carlos Hyde, if he stays healthy, could get increased value as well because, with a really good passing game, I think it opens up the floor for the running game as well. So, it's something to look forward to, something to keep an eye on as we head into the franchise tag deadline tomorrow and next week when we hit free agency. Well, as for another free agent at the tight end position, Martellus Bennett he wants a really good long-term contract. I do think he wants a very big payday. His teammate, or former teammate, Rob Gronkowski, says he's hoping he breaks the bank. So I do think that Bennett was very productive for the Patriots last season. He was a very solid fantasy tight end. He finished with 55 receptions, 701 yards, and 7 touchdowns. So he had a pretty valuable year as a fantasy tight end. I do think no matter where he goes, I do think he has potential to be a good tight end in fantasy. He's not going to be a top 5. I do think he'll be a top 10. Because tight end is probably the thinnest position in fantasy. I will probably put him at 9 or 10. I just think there's so many guys better than Bennett. But no matter on the team, I do think he could possibly go to a variety of teams. He can go to a variety of teams. And I do think if a team really wants to bring in really good red zone threats, then Martellus Bennett is the guy. I can't see him going back to Chicago. I don't think he liked it there. I can definitely see him going back to the Giants. I can definitely see him going to the Packers. I don't know if he will be going back to Dallas. He's definitely not going back to New England. New England just don't like overpaying for guys. But I do think Martellus Bennett, I do think he can be really productive. And, he made a base salary of $5 million last season. And, the Pats wanted to extend Bennett through 2017, but they just couldn't go on an agreement. Maybe Bennett wanted too much money, but Bennett is probably the top free agent at the tight end position on the market. He's going to generate a lot of interest. I do think no matter who signs him, I do think they're getting a very productive tight end. And I do think depending on the team he goes to, his fantasy value will be affected. But last season, Bennett was really good in relief for Gronkowski. Bennett was a very solid tight end. At times he looked like a tight end one. And I do think with Gronkowski coming back, I do think Bennett's value would have been hindered a little bit if he decided to come back to New England. But, it remains to be seen where Bennett will go and the interest of the market for Martellus Bennett will be. So that's something to look at when we hit the free agency period next week. All right, well, I'm going to take my last break. And I'm going to get into some news of Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell. So, yeah, it looks like business is booming for Antonio Brown. And I will discuss the fantasy value on those guys when I get back to Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Hello, welcome back to Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. And it looks like business is booming for Antonio Brown. And the Steelers made Antonio Brown the highest paid receiver in the NFL. The two parties they agreed to a 4-year extension that was worth $68 million that will run through 2021. So the deal, it looks like, is set to pay him at least $17 million annually, and that surpasses AJ Green's $15 million. So it's going to influence the open market for Alshon Jeffrey and definitely Deshaun Jackson. So I do think Alshon Jeffrey has a chance to get a big paycheck, and I don't think he will have any trouble in doing so. But anyways, the impact for Antonio Brown, it just remains the same. He's going to be one of the first top 5 players drafted in leagues next year. There's nothing changing that. He's still the top receiver in the game. I still think he's one of the best players in the game. So there's nothing that's going to change. I do think this will value Ben Roethlisberger. I do think the fantasy value on the quarterback there will do well. I do think if Big Ben didn't come back, and if the Steelers had to go with Landry Jones, I think Antonio Brown would have been fine in fantasy no matter what. I do think he's a guy that makes plays no matter who's there. He's one of those game-changing, game-breaking stars that can really, really impact the game, and that's just what he does. But Antonio Brown, he's been, ever since he came into the league, he's been one of the top receivers over a 4-year span. He has 481 receptions. That is more than any player in the league. Brown's not going to slow down. This deal is going to go towards in his 30s, and it was a no-brainer for the Steelers to re-sign him or extend him. So I do think Antonio Brown is one of the main foundations of this team, and nothing changes from a fantasy perspective. And I do think this has a chance for Alshon Jeffrey to get an even bigger paycheck no matter what team signs him. But that wasn't the only thing that the Steelers did yesterday. They placed the running back, Le'Veon Bell, their star running back, on the exclusive franchise tag. And what the exclusive franchise tag does is that Le'Veon Bell cannot talk to any other team. If a team were to sign and were to give an offer sheet the Steelers will have to match that offer sheet. So it looks like the Steelers are not going to they're not going to let Le'Veon Bell go anywhere. It's not. They just can't. Le'Veon Bell is probably going to be the top pick in most drafts. He's definitely going to be in the top 3. He's not going anywhere. He's not going anywhere at all. And I do think with the Steelers bringing back Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell, I do think that gives Ben Roethlisberger more reason to come back and play. So remember, Ben Roethlisberger was contemplating retirement, and I do think with the Steelers pretty much bringing back the 2 main foundations of this offense, Big Ben's probably going to come back and have a really good season again. Come on. Well, the Steelers and Le'Veon Bell, they have until July 15 to work out a long-term multi-year deal. And, Le'Veon Bell is not going to slow down. Remember, he's only 25. I know he is rehabbing a groin injury, but he avoided surgery, so that's bodes well for him. So I do think if Le'Veon Bell does stay healthy, he can become the top running back in fantasy. He just has that type of talent, but come on, that shouldn't surprise you anyway. I shouldn't surprise you. But yeah, the Steelers, they wasted no time in extending Antonio Brown. They wasted no time in hitting or placing Le'Veon Bell with the franchise tag. And I do think Le'Veon Bell, he's still a top 3 running back. He can be the top 1. I do think he's going to be drafted as a top running back in most fantasy leagues. So I do think all these 2 guys, they impact Ben Roethlisberger's fantasy value, because if Ben Roethlisberger does not have both of these guys, Ben Roethlisberger is not the same productive quarterback, in my opinion. So it looks like, Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell, they're going to be in the first round. It looks like Big Ben can be a second rounder. And honestly, there's really nothing else to talk about with these guys and their fantasy value. They're pretty much studs. You guys should know that. But, I do have to talk about this news because this does impact other players on the team. All right, well, that's going to conclude it. That's going to do it for me. I like to thank you guys for tuning in. And, man, we actually had a lot to talk about today. AP becoming a free agent. I talked about, Antonio Brown. I talked about Kirk Cousins potentially going to the 49ers. So it was a busy day here. But, I have to thank you guys for tuning in. Don't forget to come back on Friday. Anthony will be back. We will discuss anything fantasy football related. And, we got the Combine coming up this week. So we'll probably discuss how prospects' fantasy value could potentially be. We're not still sure on that yet. But, yeah, as always, I'm your host, Jeremiah. I'd like to thank you guys for tuning in. You guys can catch the show on a variety of platforms. iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and on YouTube. And, of course, you can always check out the website, gsmcpodcast.com. You can also follow the show on Twitter and on Instagram at the same handle at gsmc_football. And you can also like us at Facebook at the Going to Me Concepts Football Podcast. At the Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. So I'm so sorry about that. And then, so I thank you guys for tuning in. And this is the Going to Me Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast. You guys have a great day and come back on Friday.